It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative Party MP and Party Deputy Chairman Lee Rowley, the Labour MP Siobhain McDonagh, the Green Party's co-leader Jonathan Bartley and Times columnist Melanie Phillips. Today,
he's the Prime Minister, he's the most powerful politician in the land, and if business people have funded the upgrade of his flat, then we need to know.
I don't really care who paid for it as long as my constituents didn't pay for it.
More questions about what's going on in Downing Street. The man in charge of the civil service says only this.
I'm very constrained in what I can say.
We'll ask the Conservative Deputy Chair if the party can give any answers.
Since morning we are calling people, trying for oxygen and everything, but nobody's responding.
Hospitals overwhelmed in India. Should we be sending vaccine doses as well as ventilators? And should a tweet like this lead someone to lose their job? Let's start with the swirl of allegations surrounding Number 10, Boris Johnson and Whitehall. Take a look at the Daily Mail front page. They have tried to tie all the various strands together with the headline, Boris on the ropes, on bodies leak, on Number 10 decor, on Chatty Rat. My opening question to you, the panel is Boris Johnson on the ropes? Jonathan?
Yeah, I think we may have reached a tipping point where the chickens have come home to roost, where people realise that he is a serial liar. I hope that the right-wing media are now turning on him, having treated him as a lovable rogue up until this point, and are going to call him to account for his serial lying and for his mismanagement of COVID, which has resulted in the unnecessary deaths of tens of thousands of people in this country.
And, of course, we'll put some of that to Lee Rowley as Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. Melanie, do you believe Boris Johnson is on the ropes?
Not necessarily. I mean, clearly these are very serious charges, some of them much more serious than others, and he's going to have some considerable explaining to do, and I've no doubt there will be some damage. But I think among the general public, you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but I'm afraid that many people, if not most, have kind of priced in the idea that politicians are sleazy and corrupt and so on. That's a terrible thing to say, but I think they have. And also, some of these allegations are coming from Dominic Cummings, and people have still uppermost in their mind the fact that he broke lockdown by going to Barnard Castle infamously. And so they are less inclined, I think, to take what he says seriously. Of course, it depends what he comes up with in terms of actual evidence, and that could obviously change the atmosphere very considerably. But I think that it's wrong to put all these things in one basket. I think some of these things that are being thrown around are much more serious than others.
Siobhain, what's your view? Is he on the ropes?
Who knows? We've got to find what the facts are, because if he's had a loan, he hasn't declared it, and that means he's in front of the Standards Committee. If the Conservative Party have paid the bill, even in the beginning, then they're up before the Electoral Commission. And we need to worry about these things because it's important that people can have confidence in the Prime Minister, and it's important that no one can buy our Prime Minister. Lee,
this will be, at the very least, surely a distraction from the job that the government says it needs to focus on. The instruction coming out of Number 10, particularly with the Cabinet meeting going on, is we're getting on with jobs and jabs. But how can they, with all this going on?
Well, they can because they are, and, you know, we've seen just over the last 24 hours another 350,000 jabs put in arms, and the people aged over 42 just in the last hour or so being able to go and get vaccines. But I accept there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of noise over some issues, some predating this administration, some within this administration, and the government is doing what any reasonable government would do, and where there needs to be further investigation into those areas, it's been agreed, and that is underway. And I agree with Siobhain, we need to see what the facts are, and that's what due process is. And rather than Jonathan go around making the claims that he has, I think we wait and see what those facts are and then go from there. But the government is getting on with its job in the meantime, quite rightly.
Right, Siobhain, I know you... hang on a second, Jonathan. I know you want to come back in briefly, because we're going to get into some of the charges that have been made. Siobhain?
Yeah, what I don't understand is how can the Prime Minister is alleged to have phoned newspaper journalists to claim that Dominic Cummings had leaked stuff. You know, if you're dealing with the coronavirus lockdown and the impact on the economy and vaccinations, how have you got the time to do it? Why would you want to do that sort of stuff? I fear that number 10 is decaying from the inside out. And that is a real worry because you can't concentrate on stuff when all this madness is flying around.
Lee?
Focus is there because we've seen it, and we've seen, as I say, jabs opening up today, hundreds of thousands of people getting jabbed over the weekend. We've seen announcements on schools and other areas of policy just in the last few hours alone. And this is the fundamental thing which people tell me when I'm in my constituency and I was out and about in the weekend. We want the government to get on with things, and that is what the government is doing. A lot of this stuff, you know, I'm not denying the right of people to ask questions. That's absolutely appropriate within the political system. But a lot of this stuff, to me, has the tinge of a very, very big Westminster bubble, and we all get ourselves extremely excited when we're down here, as I am at the moment. And when I go home to North Derbyshire, I know that most people are talking about completely different things, as is normal within the political process.
Right, well, you say it's the Westminster bubble. Let's just show everybody the front page of the Daily Mirror. Not just bodies. It says, Boris, we loved them. Now, 3 people say Boris Johnson raged, let bodies pile high. Now, this is the allegation that the Prime Minister said he would rather see bodies pile high than approve another lockdown last autumn. The Prime Minister's denied that he made that comment, but both the BBC and ITV have now separately reported that sources have said he did make that comment. Do you believe the Prime Minister, Lee?
Yes, the Prime Minister said clearly he didn't say it, and I take the Prime Minister at his word. And we have effectively a number of anonymous, unknown sources saying one thing, and the Prime Minister being very clear about what he said. I mean, you know, if you stand back on this, of course there were difficult decisions to make about lockdown over the course of the last year. None of us ever wanted to make those decisions full stop, and there would have been decisions and robust discussions at that about the challenges of lockdown and the implications of it, because we always accepted there were implications. But the Prime Minister has been very clear he didn't make those statements, and I take him at his word. And again, you know, the focus of the government remains on sorting out the issues which we have, building back better, sorting out the economy, rather than the kind of focus where the media and Daily Mail or Daily Mirror want to go.
Right, Siobhain, do you believe the Prime Minister?
I think the evidence suggests the contrary. We can see that he was dragged kicking and screaming to the second and a third lockdown. I mean, if we remember, after Christmas, they actually sent primary schools and secondary schools back for a day and then lockdown. So clearly there was a struggle at the heart of government between locking down and seeing as supporting the economy. So whether he said those exact words, I don't know. But you can see that we locked down too late. We've had the biggest death rate in Europe. You can see that we should have locked our borders long. So this struggle is there for everybody to see.
Right. But that is, as you say, around the substance of lockdown. On the words themselves, which the Prime Minister has denied saying. Jonathan, is that what you were talking about? You're calling the Prime Minister a liar. He says he didn't say it.
I was actually referring to the video by Peter Stavanovich, which has 10 cases in the House of Commons where he's lied, and Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has a meeting with the Speaker. On this particular issue, and I'll address that now, we know that Robert Peston is reporting that we have people who will now say they will go on oath to say that the Prime Minister is not telling the truth. The bigger point is that people know deep down that the Prime Minister lies. We've got an Evening Standard poll coming out later today, say 6 in 10 people have lost trust in the Prime Minister. This is about the whole institution of government, people not having faith that the Prime Minister will uphold the standards of his office.
All right,
and with a ministerial code that he is supposed to uphold, and you can't trust him to uphold his own code of standards.
Well, that's your charge. But Melanie, you heard there Lee Rowley saying these are unnamed, as yet, unnamed sources. So these are off the record. They're unattributable in a sort of public sense. Will it be a sort of he said, he didn't say?
Well, I think this is all for the public. It must be completely irritating as well as baffling. I mean, you have different rival camps all quoting unnamed sources. There's not a shred of proper evidence or proof yet. The Prime Minister, as has been said, has vehemently denied the first of these allegations, the one about thousands of bodies. The Times has reported this morning that he was heard saying, let it rip, in a similar state of frustration at the thought of another lockdown. Now, we don't know the context. He may have been speaking sarcastically for all we know. Clearly, there was an argument going on, as Siobhain has said. And I think that the really damaging thing that people are going to sit up and take notice of is if it is proven that he hesitated so long over locking down, not once, not twice, but 3 times, that the number of deaths was attributable to that delay, then he's in serious trouble. But at the moment, we simply don't know. I mean, no fair-minded person can possibly say where the truth of this lies.
Right. And Siobhain, do you agree on that point, that no one could possibly know for sure?
Do I know that he used those words? No, currently I don't. But do I see the evidence that there was dither in delay in bringing in the lockdowns? Yes, it's plain for anybody to see, for people of all political judgments and none. We have the biggest death rate in Europe. We've only recently locked down our borders. There was clearly a big struggle at the heart of government.
All right, we're going to leave it there and move on to the issue of Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat and who originally paid for the refurbishment of it. Now, Lee, you are the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, so you're in a very, very good position to finally provide some answers, I hope, to some of the outstanding questions, particularly about the role of the Conservative Party in this story. So, just to start off, did the party receive a donation that was used to originally pay for the refurbishment of Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat?
Forgive me, Joe, I'm not going to go into the details which you're asking for.
Do you know the answer?
There is a substantial, there is a review underway, as Simon Case talked about yesterday.
The senior civil servant.
And Constitutional Affairs Committee. I think we have to allow that due process to conclude, and then things will, if it needs to be reported to the Electoral Commission or if items need to be reported in the Ministerial Gift Register, then they will be done so in due course. But due process is important in this process, and I think we need to allow that to happen.
But these are very straightforward questions, and you are the Deputy Chair, the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, and most of the people watching this programme will assume you'll know the answers to these straightforward questions because they involve the Conservative Party. So did the Conservative Party receive a loan that was used to originally pay for the redecoration of the flat?
On a personal level, I have, my remit does not include fundraising, so I don't know the answer to these questions. But irrespective of that, the reality is that there is a process underway and we need to allow that process to conclude, and then happy to come back and talk about those on this programme or anywhere else.
Right. So who did give the Conservative Party the money that was used to originally pay for the refurbishment, as has been reported?
I'm sorry, Joe, I can only repeat what I've said previously. I accept that there is interest in this area. I accept that this will be gone through, and I accept that there will be clarity given. But I'm not in a position to offer those today. I think people watching at home would understand the point that I'm making, that we have to allow due process to conclude, and once that's been concluded, happy to come back and talk about it.
But what is the due process? Why does there need to be a review? These aren't difficult questions. They're just yes or no answers to how a certain amount of money arrived at the Conservative Party, as has been reported, and whether or not it was used to refurbish the flat, and then whether Boris Johnson paid back that money in full or paid it back in stages. What's the review about?
There's been a number of questions that have been asked by those in the media and beyond about what has happened here. The government, and Simon Case said yesterday from the civil service perspective that he would spell out what has occurred, and we're going to do that. We can't have it both ways. People are asking for clarity about what's happening. We're going to provide clarity about what happens. There's processes to do that, and we should allow that to happen, and then obviously happy to discuss at that point.
Do you understand why people might think it's a bit strange that you're the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party and you can't answer those questions?
I'm saying to you that those questions will be answered, and I'm saying that there is a process to answer them, and we just have to wait until that process is concluded. So we have all the facts, on the table, so we understand what happened, so we have a full view of what occurred, and then we can talk about it. Absolutely, happy to do so.
Right, OK, and we'll obviously wait with bated breath for that to happen. I suppose people might say, you're saying that you can't answer those questions or won't answer these questions at the moment until due process has been done. Simon Case, who is the country's top civil servant, who is in charge of reviewing this whole episode, also can't say anything. Who does know the answer to the questions? Who are you getting the information from when this review is carried out?
There's obviously going to be a process that has gone through, and that's happening at the moment, at the same time as the government does everything else, which we've already talked about in the last few minutes, and then there'll be an outcome to that. But I really think we have to allow all of the facts and all of the information to be collated, for it to then to be put in the public domain, to allow you, everybody else on this panel, and everybody else in the country to take a view. And, you know, that is a normal, transparent process which would happen, plus the review on top of that. And I think that's the appropriate way to go. In the meantime, the government is getting on with what it needs to do. Right,
Siobhain, why does any of this matter? I can hear you shouting there.
Look, I understand why Mr Rowley's doing it, but he's claiming the fifth because he could criminalise the Conservative Party, because if they did receive £58,000 from Lord Brownlow, and that was given to the Prime Minister to pay his redecoration bills, then actually they're up in the court and their collar's going to be felt, because that is a criminal action.
Lee?
If the money was given directly from Lord Brownlow or another donor to the Prime Minister, then he has broken the Standards Code as an MP and as a minister, and he's up before the Standards Board. So this does matter, and it matters. I know there's lots of exciting, lurid details, and I'm not being holier now. I find it fascinating myself. But the real issue is we simply can't have people, Prime Ministers, redecorating their flat from money from donors.
Right.
It's just wrong.
Except, of course, Charles Walker, Conservative MP, said as long as it's not his taxpayers, his constituents, Melanie, then he really doesn't mind if it was paid for by a donor, we don't know yet, or it was a loan from the Conservative Party. There are registers of interest, in fact, several of them, which Downing Street will no doubt say it'll all be declared in due course. But does it matter in the way that Siobhain said, Melanie?
Yes, of course it matters. It matters a great deal. It is entirely, what's being alleged would be entirely improper. And the fact is, as has already been said, what is there to inquire into? If it was a straightforward matter that Boris Johnson, on receiving a bill for the redecoration of the Downing Street flat, put his hand into his pocket or got out his checkbook and wrote a cheque for it, there is nothing to inquire into. The only reason you have to inquire into anything is because something irregular happened. Now, quite what that irregularity is, we don't know, and quite what it amounted to, we'll no doubt be told in the fullness of time. But the fact is that the very fact that there is something to inquire into means there is something not right here. And of course it matters. It is simply not within the rules for the private flat in Downing Street to be paid for through public money. As far as I can recall, Simon Case alluded to this in his evidence when he said that even if a trust were to be set up, as had been mooted some time ago, for the general upkeep of Downing Street, then that could not include the private apartments or the private residence of the Prime Minister. That has to be paid for out of his private money, not public money.
Jonathan, there is a bigger issue around how business is conducted, how ministers behave. Various people have said that ministerial codes, lobbying rules all have to be updated. But if we return to the original conversation at the beginning of the programme, do you accept that in the modern world, in 2021, politicians will use WhatsApp and text messages to get things done, and not every single message you send then has to be informed to someone official?
Well, I accept that politicians will use it. Is it right that that is not passed on and declared as is required by the ministerial code? Absolutely not. And the worry is that the ministerial code is, the forward is written by the Prime Minister, it's produced by the Cabinet Office. The Prime Minister has responsibility for enforcing the ministerial code. Now, if he's in breach of the ministerial code, there is a clear conflict of interest and there must be reform. And on the wider point, I think why this hits home so hard is that we all know that for years and years, donors have bought influence in various ways from politicians, whether it be the fossil fuel industry lobbying against action on climate change, or whether it be buying effectively a place in the second chamber in Parliament. We all know that these donors get rewarded. It's done very cleverly, but they get rewarded with seats in the second chamber of Parliament. This is outrageous. And why are we not calling for wholesale reform? And why has there not been reform before now?
Well, Lee, is it time for the sort of reform that Jonathan is talking about? Do you think it'll happen?
Well, there's obviously the review into lobbying, which is underway, and we should see what comes out of that. I mean, are there ways in which the House of Lords can work better? I mean, absolutely. I'm not particularly keen on where the House of Lords has landed in the first place on a personal level. But fundamentally, there is an absolute legitimate role for government and for businesses to interact, to understand how business works, to understand how government is doing things. That all has to be done in a transparent and above the board manner. It is done so in the same way that there's an absolutely legitimate way for different governments to interact with each other. And it's about making sure that those things are done in the right way with the right level of public confidence, rather than saying, this shouldn't happen, or wholesale reform, which doesn't actually add anything to the debate, in my view. And
just to let viewers know, that was the division bell ringing behind you in case they are confused. But Lee, what about on private communications? Should there be any space for private communications that aren't monitored between ministers?
I think William Hague had an interesting article in the Telegraph today about this, which was when he was talking about when he was Foreign Secretary a few years ago, and how the growth of text messages and WhatsApp and things like that, how there was this big debate at the heart of government at the time about what was appropriate and what was not. And we all know there is a recognition in our professional lives, whether we be in politics or elsewhere, that some of these things are very handy to interact with people on. But within politics, we know that there are rules and there are boundaries, and that we should make sure that we adhere to those. And I think that is the area which is under debate at the moment. But you can't abolish WhatsApp, and you can't abolish the ability to communicate with people. So it's about making sure that you have the right conversations in the right place, and then also recording the outcomes of those discussions where it's necessary and appropriate to do so.
Siobhain?
I think, we always chase to follow up technology, don't we? But this goes far deeper than a WhatsApp message or a text
It does, but
message.
Siobhain, on the very basic thing, I mean, if Labour were in government, they would be using WhatsApp, they would be texting people.
Yeah.
Does there need to be a private space where ministers, perhaps where officials, can talk to each other without feeling that everything is being recorded or noted down, or is that gone?
I think it's a difficult balance, isn't it? I think there has to be private space for discussion. Several years back, my phone was stolen, and it ended up in News International, and the police brought me my text messages that they'd found on a computer. And when I read back what some people had texted me, I thought, I don't think the public would, or that they'd want the public to see that. Not that there was anything wrong about it, but it was just personal. So, of course, there is a space for personal discussion. But what's going on at the moment with David Cameron and Greensley, and we've got the Treasury Select Committee tomorrow, and it's extraordinary. Somebody was working at the heart of government who was also working for that company. There was no contract. I mean, there are some very serious things going on.
And we will look at some of those over the coming days. We're going to end it there because we're going to talk about the situation in India. I'm sure many of you will have been watching in horror at the situation unfolding there and the images coming out of the country. The number of cases seems to be increasing and the country is running out of oxygen. We're joined now from Delhi, from the capital, by our correspondent Davina Gupta. Davina, are there any signs of the situation stabilising?
For the moment, it's a grim reality that people of this country are living in. We are seeing constant increase in the numbers. The infected cases have crossed the mark of over 340,000 daily. We're also looking at loss of lives that is counting into 1,000 and crossing over 2,700 to 2,800. And this in a country of 1.3 billion people, where cities are small, where houses are congested and families are large. The infection that is spreading quite fast is leading to an unprecedented rush in hospitals, which are facing acute shortage of oxygen, essential medicines and beds.
What help has actually arrived? What's India asking for?
In India, what we're seeing right now is a story of global collaboration as well, because India has asked for global aid. It's not able to meet with the oxygen supply deficit it's seeing in the country. It doesn't have enough infrastructure to transport oxygen from green zones to hotspots. So what we've seen is countries like the UK being among the first responders. The UK has promised at least 9 airline containers for oxygen ventilators or oxygen concentrators, and the first one arrived today with 100 ventilators and 95 oxygen concentrators. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was also in a call with the US President Joe Biden, who's promised aid. They've announced something called a strike force, which means along with essential medical supplies and oxygen kits, the US will be sending epidemiologists and also health experts to help the public health workers here to fight the infection better. We've also seen the European Union saying they'll pool in resources. Also, the French president posted a social media message in Hindi saying that we are all in this together. But all the help that's coming, even from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Singapore, Hong Kong, all responding with the oxygen tankers that India needs to supply this crucial life-saving gas. At the end of the day, it seems that more needs to be done, and it's just a drop in the ocean.
Davina in Delhi, thank you very much for joining us there, Davina Gupta. Lee, listening to that, the medical supplies are arriving from the UK, but they clearly need more. Should the UK be doing more?
Well, as has just been talked about there, the UK government, as with other governments around the world, has tried to and continues to try and offer support for what is a terrible situation in India, and we hope that it improves very quickly. And we will continue to be as supportive as we can be in terms of the oxygen compressors, which have already gone, and the ventilators, which are already on the way, and whatever we can to assist with equipment, we will try and do that, and the government's committed to it. It's a very difficult situation. We're going to get these instances of different countries having difficult spells. Brazil had one last month. We had one a number of months ago, and this is the nature of the virus, and it's about trying to be supportive where we can as an international community.
Jonathan?
I think there's a big issue beyond supplying the oxygen. For a long time, since the beginning of the year, we've been calling for vaccine solidarity and saying that the patents which control the manufacture and distribution should be suspended, as countries like India and South Africa have lobbied the World Trade Organization to have happen. But the UK government has stopped this happening. Now, in India, they could have, months ago, been producing vaccines and have a much greater supply. We know that regions in India have been saying they haven't been able to get hold of all the vaccines that they need. So in the short term, we're left with a very difficult situation where we're trying to patch up a desperate situation, which actually, in a great measure, could have been avoided if we had this vaccine solidarity rather than vaccine nationalism.
Right, well, let's talk about the short-term solution that you're alluding to in terms of vaccinations, because there is an opportunity for the UK to perhaps slow down slightly its vaccination rollout. Let me just show our viewers the Health Secretary Matt Hancock's tweet. He said, "I'm very excited to open up vaccination to 42-year-olds. It's come down another 2 years, standing by my phone, awaiting my text. Over 42s can now book a jab." But Jonathan, would you advocate now, perhaps going on the doorstep, it's local elections at the time, saying, listen, India is in desperate need of vaccinations, and we could either slow down the rollout in terms of younger age groups slightly, or perhaps delay people getting their second jabs by a week or two, as long as it was still within the 12 weeks. Would you do that?
I think, given the situation that we're in, I think we first of all have to say there is a moral case where every life is of equal worth. If there are things that we can do which are going to save lives, and let's remember that even if we did pass our vaccines on now, they're not going to address the situation immediately. They're going to help people in 4, 5, 6 weeks. And given the desperate situation, I think there is a case for slowing down, making sure everyone gets their second jabs in this country, yes, but potentially slowing down and maybe saying for every vaccine we're giving here, one should stay in India, because of course some are coming from India. The absurd situation where they're sending vaccines to us when they desperately need them there. I think if we can show that we can maintain safety here and minimize loss of death here, but we can save many more lives in India, I think there is a very, very strong, compelling case for that.
Right. Would you agree, Melanie?
I think that a country's first duty is to its own people. What's happening in India is appalling, and I believe that some of the blame, if not much of the blame, has to rest with Narendra Modi, who a few weeks ago was going around saying it's all over and encouraging people to have mass gatherings, which were super spreader events and so on. Clearly, there is a moral obligation to help in these desperate situations, and countries, I think, should make vaccines available where they have spare capacity. But Britain has not got yet to that point, in my view. Even though its vaccination programme has been rightly hailed as so much better than has been going on in Europe, the fact is that most people in Britain, as I understand it, who have been vaccinated, have only had one vaccination. Now, that offers some protection, but not enough. There are still a lot of people in Britain who are not protected. And, you know, Britain hopes to come out of its restrictions very soon. And, I mean, I'm in Israel. And one can see what happened in Israel a few months ago, in January, whenever it was, December, January, I've forgotten when it was. Israel was far ahead of the world in vaccination. It was all going gangbusters. People were getting vaccinated at an enormously high rate. Everyone was very excited. And then it went into lockdown because, lo and behold, the Kent variant arrived. And among the people who were not yet vaccinated, who tended to be younger, people in their 40s and 50s, they were becoming so ill that the hospitals were beginning to get overrun. Now, that is, I hope that's not going to happen in Britain. Maybe the one vaccination will hold the situation enough. Okay. But Britain is not near the point where it can actually relax and say, well, we've come out of this now, so we can afford to help other people. Well, yes, of course we must help India, but the first...
It's in Britain's interests to make sure that India, which currently is effectively a petri dish for new variants with this huge outbreak. It's in our own interests, not just the moral case that every life is equal.
What on earth is Britain doing, still allowing people to be coming in from India?
Well, sooner or later, people are going to travel.
Irresponsibility.
The point. I agree with you, Melanie. I absolutely agree with you. But the point is, we can't keep people out indefinitely. And if new variants spring up in India, eventually, whether we like it or not, they will make their way here. You can't just close our borders permanently forever, can you?
Right. Well, Siobhain, on the issue, though, of whether we should slow down the rollout of the vaccine here, as long as everyone is kept safe and within the time limits, is this a policy Labour should be advocating?
So I'm sorry to say this, but I think you're setting up an argument that doesn't resolve the problem. Because what it would seem to me that India needs at the moment are field hospitals, more oxygen, a way of dealing
and vaccination
with those becoming infected. They have the science and they have the ability to produce vaccine, and we need to do what Jonathan referred to about making it easily available and cheap. But at the moment, the practical things I think that people in India need is oxygen and ways of organising more hospitals and more intensive care units. I think we have I know we're praising our vaccination scheme, which has been great, and the volunteers and the doctors and everybody have been marvellous. But in my constituency, 15 to 20% of vulnerable groups of people are not taking the vaccine. And the services and the drop-in centres and the vaccination centres where they live, they're not where they live.
Okay.
So we are going for numbers, but we are in serious trouble, I believe, that we are not getting to significant numbers of people working in social care, people who are poorer, and more vaccine sceptic. And because we've become so interested in hitting the target, we are not putting the time and effort into these vulnerable groups. And if we are not careful, that will come back to bite us.
All right, Siobhain, I'm going to interrupt there because I want to pick up on something Melanie said. Melanie, you're in Israel and you've been based there for some time as restrictions are now beginning to be lifted. I think we can show our viewers the Jerusalem Post headline, which says, COVID cap on gatherings to increase as restrictions continue to be lifted. We'll probably show that to you in just a moment. There it is. Tell us what it's been like living there then, as it's been unlocking?
Well, it's been very good for some weeks now. The situation has eased very considerably. I mean, Israel's lockdowns were pretty ferocious. At one stage, we were not able to go beyond, I think it was 1,000 metres of our house. Except for essential supplies. I mean, and you know, Israel did actually lock down its borders. It did actually stop people coming in from through its airports, and there are still very, very severe restrictions on incoming air travel. But now, you know, the restaurants are open. Public events are open. There are still restrictions on the numbers who can gather inside and so on, but these are gradually being eased the whole time. The rate of infections has come right down. The dreaded surge that was dreaded when children started going back to school didn't actually happen. And the reason for all this is that sufficient numbers have been vaccinated very, very fast. It was an amazing operation. That's another story. But the fact is, you know, it reached a critical mass. Something like, I don't know, 80% of all vaccinatable people in Israel are now doubly vaccinated. It's something like that. I'm not quite sure of the actual figure, but enough to really make all the difference. And the way they did it, they first of all vaccinated, you know, the very vulnerable, the most vulnerable. But the younger people who thought they weren't vulnerable weren't going to be vaccinated.
Right.
And they used the green passport to open that up. Only if you had the green passport could you have access to stuff. And that got young people in. Now, I know in Britain there's a tremendous head of steam against the idea of a green passport, a vaccination passport. But in Israel, it managed to get to the point where sufficient numbers were vaccinated to allow the economy to start opening up again and people to be free again.
All right, well, on that point, I mean, you'll have heard the phrase, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And on the back of the discussion that we've just had about India, why isn't Israel helping the Palestinians more in terms of their neighbours who also need vaccinating if Israel is to feel truly safe?
Really, this is a sort of BBC obsession, isn't it?
No,
this is the false
I think it's a very
not helping the Palestinians.
I didn't say not, but could they be helping them more, bearing in mind they are their neighbours and it is a case of making sure everyone is safe?
The Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, which is responsible under international law for the healthcare of its own people, has made it very clear that it doesn't want Israel's help. It made its own arrangements through the WHO. It ordered significant amounts of the Sputnik vaccine, I believe. That's what it was. It preferred. It said it did not want any help from Israel. At some point, I think perhaps on one or 2 points, it got into difficulties because of a shortfall of supplies. It came to Israel. Israel helped. It gave thousands of doses. So where is this myth and this libel coming from the BBC all the time, that Israel doesn't help its Palestinian neighbours?
Right. Well,
I really think you've got to stop this.
Well, first of all, it isn't a libel, and secondly, the figures the Palestinian vaccination rates weren't the same, and on the philosophical basis of no one is safe until everyone is safe, people can ask the question. But we are going to move on to our final discussion for the programme. Let me just show you this headline, which is in Pink News. And it says, Maya Forstater wants UK's Equality Act to protect people who say trans women are men. Now, Maya Forstater, her contract wasn't renewed. She lost her job in 2019 after a series of tweets that she made, including this one, in which it says, yes, I think that male people are not women. I don't think being a woman, female, is a matter of identity or womanly feelings. It is biology. People of either sex should not be constrained or discriminated against if they don't conform to traditional gender expectations. Now, there were complaints from some of her colleagues who claimed it was transphobic. Maya Forstater pursued the case in court and argued that her beliefs should be protected as philosophical beliefs under the 2010 Equality Act. The judge, though, ruled her views were not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Jonathan, why is this case important?
Well, you've got an agenda I didn't ask for it to be discussed, but I do think it is important in terms of transgender rights. The Green Party supports trans rights unequivocally, 100%. When it comes to issues in the workplace, I think we're all on a learning curve. I know I'm approaching 50. I've been on a steep learning curve over the last 5 years. And the reason we support self-identification and trans rights is because we believe it's important for a compassionate response. And when you're in the workplace and you feel you're a trans person or a trans ally and you feel unsafe, that has serious implications for a workplace. Similarly, a workplace may feel that there's a reputational risk if someone is going on social media and saying things which can be construed or interpreted as hate speech. And I'm not saying this is hate speech. I'm not familiar enough with what was said to make that judgment. But I do think employment tribunals, which can look at all the evidence, are a good place to work these things through. And I'd like to see those protections continue in law that I think would provide that security for whatever protected group feel they're under threat, whether that be racism, race hate, misogyny, or indeed transphobia.
Melanie?
Well, this case is actually about the rights of somebody not to be discriminated against if she takes a view that sex is rooted in biology and is therefore immutable and is different from gender, a view which is held by the mainstream of the population. And it's not a question of being horrible to trans people or interfering with trans rights. This is about the rights of somebody to say something which for most people is simply a statement of fact. There is a perfectly, not just a perfectly reasonable view, but it is a mainstream view that sex and gender are different, and they have been confused in this whole transgender debate. And the idea that it is right to make it impossible for somebody to work if they say that sex is immutable because it's based in biology and is different from gender, is an infringement of someone's right to work. It's an infringement of their freedom of speech, and it's almost a kind of a criminalization of the idea that you can actually say that biology is fixed,
right? Well,
which is an extraordinary state of affairs.
Right. Well, Siobhain, the Index on Censorship agrees with Melanie. They're making a legal intervention in the case on the grounds of free speech. What do you think?
I just think this is the question that all politicians fear. There are great debates going out in every single party about the issue of women's rights and trans rights, but I don't understand why it can't be just and. Women and girls need to be protected, and so do trans people.
But should you be allowed to say? But should you be allowed to say things? But should you be allowed to say things on Twitter with freedom of speech in mind and still keep your job?
Should you be able to say anything on Twitter? No, of course not. Should you be able to express your view in a reasonable manner? Yes, of course you should.
Lee?
But this will be decided in the courts this afternoon. But somehow we have to ratchet the kind of intensity of this.
Lee, your thoughts?
It's a very sensitive issue, and I want to tread carefully on this. And trans communities, as every other community within our country, have the right to live their lives freely. But if you take the specific example out and look at the philosophical question is, do people and can people and should people have the right to freedom of speech? Absolutely, completely, totally, from my perspective. I live by the Enlightenment notion that from 200 years ago that you have the right to say what you wish, so long as you're not harming others or seeking to encourage other people to harm others. At the same time, with rights come with responsibilities, and we should be extremely cautious on a personal level and have manners about how we exercise those rights and exactly what we do and don't want to say.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye-bye.